Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello to the folks who are on Zoom today. I appreciate whatever reason you need to be there. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do the, the Zoom attendance first, just so that we, I basically don't have to call out your names while I'm doing this. Great. Okay, so then I'm gonna run through this real quick and then we'll dive in. Today, we're gonna finish up our lecture on what is psychology. We only have a couple slides to cover for that. And then we're gonna start talking about research methods, which is really the crux of the science of psychology. So, all right, Mia, Deja, Nora, Abby, Monica, Sarah, Miriam, Lauren, Micaiah, Lyric, Onyx, India. Double checking she's not online. Nope. Okay. Jalen. Okay. Fridays will start to get tough for folks. All right. Ray. Okay. Heaven. Sydney. Alex. Sarah. Linda, Antoinette, and Grayson. Okay, we are getting there. I might have to do that another week. Little memory. Okay, so I just wanted to take a couple minutes before we dive back in to look at some of the stuff on Blackboard and where you find it. So just in case you haven't found them yet, the Explain It to the Media quizzes are here. And then you just click in. If you click and then click out and don't answer it, it will record you having not answered anything, basically. If that happens, I've already had one person do that, just email me and I can clear your attempt and you can do it. But wait till you're ready to do it, to click in. And then your Connect assignments are here. And so everything for chapter 1, for example, is all right here. For some reason, the Learn Smart modules, they've never done this before. If I don't have the due date set later than the actual due date, it will give you weird low scores. I don't know why. And so I just changed the date for all of those throughout the semester to when they're like truly due at the end of the semester so that you get your real score and not like 0.45 out of 10, which is weird. So that's where you find those. The only thing that'll take you a long time out of these is the Learn Smart modules. They walk you through the whole chapter. They really are meant to be a study technique. And so give yourself some good time to work through those. The assignments should be pretty quick. I tried to pick ones that are more fun. They have some in the book that's just like, talk about the chapter. And I tried to do ones that have like videos or interactions or things like that so that they're more interesting and hopefully more engaging for y'all. Alrighty. Well, let me go ahead and get us back into here. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this so it's not in anybody's way. And then we just have a little bit left to talk about here. Put this in slideshow. Turn on these captions because they're just a lot easier to see than the teeny tiny Zoom ones. Move the Zoom ones out of the way. Alrighty, so we went over most of these with your scavenger hunt, which I love. I think the only one we didn't really touch on, I didn't have y'all talk about clinical psychology, because I think most people know what clinical psychology is, right? Doing therapy. And cross-cultural psychology, which is looking at how individuals from different cultures or different subcultures within a main culture, like in the US, are the same, are different, things along those lines. Now, those are some of the areas of research. These are the ways you can work as an applied psychologist. And what you'll notice is a lot of these map onto things we're going to be talking about this semester, right? So we're going to talk about therapy and disorders. Those both go within clinical psychology. Clinical neuropsychology is looking at brain-based disorders. So this would be things like strokes, dementias, but also things like ADHD, learning disabilities, things along those lines. I did some neuropsychology when I was in grad school, and it was really interesting. Health psych is looking at the mind-body connection. A lot of times if you're working in health psych, and again, we're gonna have a whole chapter on this, but a lot of times if you're working in health psych, you're in a hospital setting or a private practice with physicians. School psych is just what it sounds like. These are the folks who work in schools. A lot of times school psychologists, a lot of their time is spent doing assessments for kids with like learning disabilities, things along those lines. Consumer psychology is taking the principles of social psychology that we'll talk about later in the semester and applying them to market research, how to best market things to people, things along those lines. Community psychology is kind of clinical, but you take a step back and you try to look at like the whole community rather than the individual. IO, we mentioned the other day, that's where you can make good money. You'll be working in a business setting. And then engineering, which is called human systems or human factors. You'd be working with engineers to design things that work well for humans. So here is where psychologists work. And so I think a lot of times this surprises people. Because I think a lot of times when we think of psychologists, we think of people in private practice seeing clients, right? That's only about a third of psychologists. The next biggest chunk is folks like myself, people who are teaching in colleges and universities, also doing research there as well. Here we have our health psychologists and also psychologists who might work on inpatient psychiatric wards and hospitals and clinics. Business and government. So psychologists not only conduct research within the government, but more and more they are serving as consultants for things. Even things like, as we talked about with environmental psychology, like what is the human impact on XYZ in the environment and how can we get humans to change their behavior to help it? You've got your school psychologists, elementary and secondary schools. Then you've got a fun other. Psychologists are creative. We find different ways to do things. And psychologists may also kind of do multiple things within their job or kind of change throughout the year or all the years, plural. So for example, one of the psychologists I look up to most, her name is Neva Perron. She's a psychologist from Canada and she is a clinical psychologist. So she has worked in private practice. She has taught at a university. And then sort of her biggest, most famous project is she went into an elite ballet school where rates of eating disorders are rampant and did a multi-year prevention program and reduced the rates of disordered eating dramatically. And so that was her work for several years, was working within the ballet school. The other thing that would fall into other, I should mention as well, is like sports psychology, things along those lines, which is becoming more popular. Research areas. So these, as you can see, are a little more split up. And some of these are using really fancy terms. I mean, developmental, experimental makes sense to us, right? Social. Physiological is like brain psychology, brain-based psychology. Psychometrics is assessments, so testing how we assess things in people and how we can assess it better. We're always trying to make our assessments more accurate, more inclusive. I'm just reading for my class after y'all for today, and we're reading about, the history of racial inequalities in psychology. I mean, we got to be really blatantly honest. The APA came out with a formal apology last year. Woo! So timely. I mean, like, it is what it isn't, right? But they finally were like, oh, we've been racist, we're sorry. And they're finally coming up with a plan to fix it now. But things like intelligence tests were used to try to show superiority of one race over another, for example. So modern psychometrics, people working in that field, are trying to do away with that. They're trying to be like, how can we make sure we're actually assessing this accurately in every group? Personality, we'll talk about more as we go through. Cognitive is learning, attention, thinking. And yeah, of course, we're going to have an other too. There, a little bit of everything. All right, and so here are the specialties. Clinical is still the most popular, but not everyone who gets a degree in clinical psychology is going to be seeing clients. So my degree is in clinical psychology. And I think of like the folks I know with clinical psych degrees, 3 or 4 of us are teaching at universities like this one. Some are working at the VA, some are working at the Naval Hospital. Others are working in inpatient settings or specific hospital settings. Someone I know now runs the PTSD clinic at one of the hospitals I used to work at. So certainly there's a variety of things you can end up doing with this. Counseling, for We're going to go over the difference between clinical counseling in a minute to sort of eliminate that, but that's also really popular. Then you've got school psych, IO, and then kind of everyone else is in other. So these are some themes that I believe your textbook came up with, at least in an earlier edition. They kind of map onto the themes from that are on our syllabus, but the idea is that psychology is empirical, so it's based in research, which we'll start talking about today. It's theoretically diverse. We acknowledge there's no one overarching explanation within psychology. Like I teach a whole class on theories of personality, and we just like cover the fact that like there's no one way to explain personality, just personality, right? Much less motivation, learning, all the other stuff we talk about, development, right? So psychologists conduct scientific research to test their ideas, and theories are those interrelated ideas to explain the observations they see. And psychology and other scientists evolve in a social-cultural context. So for example, the rapid growth of clinical psych, as we mentioned in our lecture, was really influenced by war-related surges. So needing to assess soldiers who are going in, but also realizing PTSD was a thing and treating people who were coming home. Behavior is determined by multiple causes. It's not just nature versus nurture, right? It's both and interacting in all kinds of ways. And we're shaped by our cultural heritage. So culture is the shared customs, beliefs, values, norms, institutions that we pass down through the generations. And this is like a really interesting side note. So my daughter is obsessed with aquatic life. It's her favorite thing. And so we were watching documentaries about orcas. Orcas are way more interesting than I realized. They're actually the apex predator, like they eat great whites sometimes. Really interesting. But orcas in different pods in different areas around the world develop culture, which you're like, what? How do they tell that? Orcas have developed different hunting techniques depending on where they live in the environment. So like there's one pod of orcas that like have taught themselves to essentially beach themselves so they can grab seals and then pull them back down into the water. No orcas anywhere else in the world do that, right? So the idea that based on your circumstances, you come up with certain behaviors that you engage in is culture, and we're seeing it in animals too. And as I mentioned, it's genes and the environment. One of my favorite professors in undergrad said genes are expressed in an environment. And this is always like, people are like, but your genes are just going to determine things. The environment shouldn't matter. The example I give that's easy for people to understand is height. Let's say you have the genes to be 6 feet tall, but you are impoverished and you do not have access to adequate nutrition growing up. You might not end up being 6 feet tall, right? Same thing can happen with any number of psychological factors. You might have a predisposition in your genes to develop depression. But if you are lucky and you have a supportive environment and you're able to modulate stress with help, then you might never actually develop depression, right? Whereas someone who doesn't have any of that will. And so people's experience of the world is highly subjective. So that's important to know too. And we fully acknowledge that, you know, your experience of even like reading one sentence may be totally different than everyone else in the world based on experiences you have had. All right, so the other day, as I was sort of scrolling through Instagram in the morning, I actually came across this great post, and so I have borrowed it. It's from the Mental Health Coalition. They're a great follow if you're still on Instagram. I know it's like becoming the old people thing versus TikTok, but and so it went over what's the difference between all these types of therapists you hear about, and I think this is really important to start thinking about. So psychiatrists versus psychologists. Psychiatrists go to med school. So just like any other doctor, your surgeon, your primary care doc you see for everything else, they all go to the same 4 years of med school together. The difference is once they graduate, they go on to different residencies. And For psychiatry, it's 3 to 5 years of psychiatric residency. It's the people who want to do child psychiatry who have to do the 5 years because they're trying to figure out what works for kids at different levels, right? Interestingly, a lot of psychiatrists are not trained at all in therapy anymore. I say that's interesting because one of the things we'll find out throughout the semester is the vast majority of modern therapies were actually developed by psychiatrists. So like the fact that they don't do therapy is really interesting. But some of them are. I was fortunate enough to get to interact with groups of psychiatry residents while I was in my training, and they were all getting, it was 2 different hospital settings, and they were all getting trained in therapy. Mostly they focus on prescribing medication. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. 1, they have the expertise. 2, they get more usually reimbursement from insurance for a 15 to 20-minute med check than they do for an hour of therapy. So if you just sort of math it out, right, it makes more sense for them to be doing the med checks. Psychologists. So this is a protected term. Technically, I'm not even supposed to be able to call myself a psychologist because I'm not licensed. Certainly in academia, we might casually refer to people as, oh, the psychologists, oh, the historians, right, things along those lines. But I could not go out and advertise myself as a psychologist because it would be false advertising since I'm not licensed. So you're going to have a PhD in clinical counseling psychology or a PsyD. So to tell you the quick difference here, I really like this breakdown. So the PhD, you're going to get the clinical training, right? You're going to need to be able to know how to do therapy, but you also get extensive research training. So I did, well, actually from my first minute pretty much on campus, my job that I got paid for within my department was to assist my graduate advisor with her research. But then I did a data-based master's thesis, a data-based dissertation. The PsyD, the main focus is going to be your clinical work. Some people who do PsyDs will do something like a dissertation, but the vast majority won't, or they'll just do like an applied product. So there we go, I can see it a little better. That's the main difference here. And whether you have a PsyD or a PhD, you can go and do the same things. My supervisors on my internship or residency year were a mix, and they didn't differentiate in terms of, you know, who was what and who was doing what. The main difference, putting this out there, I mentioned this to my seniors the other day, is honestly cost. So PsyDs are this professional school model, kind of like law school. And the assumption is you're just going to pay for it because it's going to pay off for you in the future. So people who get PsyDs often leave with $100,000 in debt because it takes 5 to 6 years. PhDs, most are modeled on a science model where you actually are paid to do your PhD. The idea is that we're investing in the future scientists. So I was in this model. So I got paid my very small stipend. It was like $14K a year, but I could live on that in rural Ohio. But the most important part is they also paid my tuition. So I wasn't having to pay my tuition off that. So PhD is great for that. Honestly, I think a lot of people think you need to get a PhD in psych to do anything. That's not the case anymore. If you want to work for someplace like a hospital, a VA, working and teaching at a university like me, then yeah, you'll need a PhD. But in fact, for the vast majority of people, if you just think, I want to do therapy, I want to be someone day-to-day on the ground working with folks, there are other degrees that you can get. So you can get a master's in counseling and then get licensed with that. So you'll see like licensed mental health counselor or licensed marriage and family therapist. MFT is a specific kind of graduate program you can go to if you're thinking, I want to make my career working with families and couples, basically. And you can do specialization. So for example, at EVMS right across town, we have a partnership with them. They have an art therapy program where you would also get all the requirements to get your licensure. Another master's level degree you can get is social work. And I think especially since we have a social work degree here, a lot of people think, well, I can't do social work because I'm doing psych. In fact, you can. The only difference is because the folks in the social work program, I'm gesturing over there because Annette Clayton, one of the social work professors, Dr. Clayton, her office is right over there, is that because they have a BSW, they can choose to skip a year of grad school. But you all could go and get an MSW after you graduate, no problem. If you decide to do a PhD in social work, you're usually saying, I want to teach people to do social work, essentially, or I want to do research about social work. So typically the MSW is what you're looking at. So then you see LC, SW, licensed clinical social workers. And actually, these are the majority of the folks who are in our counseling center on campus, are folks with masters in social work. And so they're going to be doing that day-to-day therapy with clients. The other thing social workers do, which other sort of helping professions don't, is case management. So they might work more with connecting people to resources in the community, collaborate with people's physicians, things along those lines. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Anyone who has any of the backgrounds we just talked about can call and is licensed, can call themselves a therapist or a psychotherapist. But if you ever heard someone say, I'm a mental health coach or I'm a life coach, any of you in this room right now could declare, I'm a life coach. You don't need any credentials, you don't need any licensure. I mean, in theory, this could be a good thing, right? But I could also potentially see it being very harmful if someone decides to just go and treat people, right? So just if you're looking for your own psychological care, be wary of anyone who just calls himself a coach and doesn't have licensure. Okay, so we touch basically on the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. So again, psychologists are going to get that PhD or PsyD. For those degrees, you do 4 years of undergrad, and then you go and do your 5 to 6 years of grad school, or if you're slow, it might be longer. And your grad school is entirely focused on mental health. Psychiatrists go to those 4 years of general med school and then have that 3 to 5 years where they focus on specifically psychiatry. We tend to look at things in psychology from a psychological perspective, and really you'll often hear the biopsychosocial perspective, where we try to integrate sort of everything going on with someone. Psychiatrists often view mental illness as sort of just another medical disorder we need to treat. Psychologist specialty that most psychiatrists don't know how to do is assessment. So we are extensively trained in doing things like personality tests, intelligence tests, neuropsychological tests to test for memory problems or attention problems. And then we're more often trained to do research, unless people who are psychiatrists have done an MD, PhD, often they don't get any research training. But psychiatrists can prescribe medications and admit people for hospitalization. The only caveat to this, I promise I'm not trying to be confusing, it's just the systems are confusing, is in, I believe, 2 states, New Mexico and Louisiana. If you are a psychologist and do a little extra training, you can prescribe. Some psychologists have pushed for that. Other psychologists have argued we shouldn't because we already have enough to do, right? And refer to the psychiatrist for the medication. Okay. So hopefully that's a little helpful to explain different aspects of things in terms of the various degrees you can go into. And that is something that if you end up being a psych major, you're going to hear that a bunch of times. So like, don't worry, like, you know, do I have to remember this for my senior year? No, we'll go over it a lot for you. Alrighty, so as I mentioned, research in psychology is very integral to what we do. Psychology is a science. Psychology strives to be evidence-based. And So we are trying always to study why something happens or how to help people feel better, act better, things along those lines. And we ground all that in research. And so as an example, as we go through this lecture, I will be using the example of binge eating. So if those of you who don't know what binge eating is, it's eating a very large amount of food in a short amount of time with a sense of loss of control. People who binge eat will sometimes consume 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 calories in a sitting. And it is really a way of trying to like deal with emotions, deal with stress for folks. And so why am I going to talk about this? Well, first off, my research focuses on eating behavior. And I have in the past run therapy intervention groups that focus specifically on binge eating, in addition to doing individual therapy for people with binge eating. And then the second is that I think it's relatable because everybody eats, right? We all eat every day. So we all have experience with eating, even if we don't have experience with binge eating. All right, so I love to pull these quotes up as examples of why we need research. So back in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle said, the brain is an organ of minor importance. They used to think that it was like the stomach or your kidneys or your liver that controlled things. And in fact, when the ancient Egyptians mummified people, as we mentioned previously, they just pulled the brain out through the nose, discard it, and not mummify it as they did with other organs. So again, if we had all just sort of taken Aristotle at his word, been like, cool, we wouldn't have psychology, right? We wouldn't have neuroscience. So very important to keep questioning, studying things. Back in 1899, Charles Duell from the US Patent Office said, everything that can be invented has been invented, right? You can think of like all the things right now that you're using that hadn't been invented in 1899, right? I mean, like cars were just in their infancy, computers weren't invented yet, certainly not cell phones, right? Or something as simple as like, this controls pretty much everything on my car, this little key fob, right? So yeah, obviously not true. Obviously people kept researching and striving and coming up with new patents. And there's no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home. Ken Olsen said this back in 1977. Now, to his credit, at that time, computers would have been the size of this room, or sometimes the size of this room plus the room next to us. So that made sense. Yeah, there's no reason for anybody to do that. But now, you know, where is it on me today? This has more computing power than the computer that took the Apollo astronauts to the moon, right? So we have certainly micro-sized things.
That's scary.
Isn't that scary?
That's horrible.
Yeah. I mean, on one hand, it's like great for us with technology, but also like we sent people all the way into space with that much. If anyone's seen the movie Hidden Figures, this is why we needed people like Katherine Johnson, right? Because she was the computing power. And in fact, they used to call the women who worked on these calculations computers. So it's always kind of funny to me when people are like, women can't do math, right? They used to think of it as almost like a secretarial task that they would sit and run all these formulas and whatnot. I counted the other day when I was talking to one of my other classes about this. I think we have about 8 computers in our house, if we count phones and tablets and all that good stuff, right? And some of you may have something comparable. So yeah, obviously this changed. Oops. Jump back here. All right, so what is research? It's the systematic search for facts through the use of careful observations and investigations. So I'm going to break down some of the words in this for y'all. So the systematic search is we're going about it in a systematic way. We're not just saying, I want to figure this out, let's go, right? We're coming up with a method. We're coming up with a way to do things. We're coming up with a very regimented and informed way to try to answer our questions. And then It's a search for facts. Research is based on trying to figure stuff out. I mean, research honestly is based in the human capacity to ask why, right? If you think of little toddlers, why? That's basically what researchers are doing on a higher level, trying to answer questions about things. Careful observations. Observations can be a range of things. So observations we would typically think of as maybe observing an animal in the wild or in its environment. I took an animal behavior class as a junior in college, and we had to observe an animal for 20 hours over the course of the semester. So there was a llama farm outside of town, and I sat in the field with the llamas for 20 hours. Very relaxing, actually. They were very sweet. They'd come up and like lick my hair and whatnot. I got to see like day-old babies. But that's one way of observing, right? You could also observe by giving someone a questionnaire, by doing a brain scan, or if we go more to natural science, by counting things on a petri dish, right? Things on those lines. And investigations, again, sometimes these investigations will be purely observational, but sometimes we are going to be manipulating things to see how people react. So with research, we are going to be trying to rigorously testing theories that we come up with about why people behave the way they do, how different factors interrelate, and techniques. So techniques can be a therapeutic technique. It can be a new way of studying. It can be a prevention program to try to prevent suicide or disordered eating, things along those lines. And we do this on a representative group of, sometimes you'll hear them called subjects. I like the word participants more. Participants implies that people are willfully participating, right? That they make the choice. Subject sounds like I'm subjecting you to my research, right? So, but we are testing on, again, a representative group. This has been a major problem in psychology in the past. Oftentimes we use what are called convenience samples, where we're going to just test college students because that's who we have access to if we work in universities. And I'm guilty of this too. The problem is a lot of universities are very, very white and very, very upper class or middle class and very, very like segmented by a certain region, right? And also age stratified as well. And so we need to challenge ourselves to make sure we're getting gender, racial, ethnic, sexuality representation. And again, psychologists don't always do that well, fully acknowledging it. And only by doing that can we evaluate the accuracy of these theories and techniques and also how useful they are, right? You can come up with like the most elaborate theory ever. It sounds really pretty. But if it explains like one teeny relationship in people's lives, it might not be that beneficial, right? So we're doing this to try to figure out ways to help people, ways to better our knowledge. And this can be really tricky for psychologists because we are working with very complex organisms, people, right? People are made of, I think, probably billions of cells. We have more neural pathways than there are stars in the sky, you know, and we are all pretty unique. And we also don't have ways to just, like I sometimes jokingly tell my students, if I could just like have a barcode scanner and like come around the room and be like, how much have you retained? Then I wouldn't have to give you tests, right? But that also sounds creepy and Minority Report, and I don't think I want to do that, right? So we have to like use indirect methods to study these things a lot of times. So we might be testing treatments, which again are quite complex. And we're involving things like mental health and well-being for people. So not only is that complex, but has true ramifications for people's quality of life, right? So challenges for researchers, for clinical researchers in particular, we're trying to measure things like unconscious motives. That means they're unconscious to the person we're testing too, right? So like, how are we going to get at them? We're looking at things like private thoughts. where maybe that person doesn't want to tell us what they're really thinking. Fair, right? And then things like monitoring mood changes. Like, when do I go from just feeling meh to like kind of happy? Like, I don't know, right? So those things can be really tricky too. So we use the scientific method to do this, to try to guide us. Psychology is usually classified as a social science, but it certainly has elements of natural science. Where I went to undergrad, it actually was classified as a natural science, and you'll see it sort of straddle the lines depending. But regardless of sort of what area you fall on, we're going to be using the scientific method. And so this is, again, systematically gathering and evaluating information, and it's the systemized pursuit of knowledge through observation. So again, we're doing this in a very systematic way. We're trying to get at how do we figure stuff out in a way that actually tells us the answer and not just our own guesses, basically. So our objectives within psychological science, but also science in general, are just descriptions. You know, when we started out, we were just describing disorders. What are the symptoms of schizophrenia, right? What are the symptoms of binge eating disorder? We could also describe other things. What does this therapy consist of? What are we going to be doing in the room with the client? Prediction of what the outcome will be. So in experiments, this is often, if I do X, then the person will do Y. In therapy, it is, I predict the person will get better, right? Otherwise, why are we bothering to do therapy? Control. So we're not trying to like mind control our participants. What we're trying to do instead is control extraneous variables that might be influencing the outcomes of our research. This is why when like biochemical studies are done, they're done in clean rooms, right? Because they're trying to eliminate the influence of other things. And then understanding, trying to understand why people do what they do, why disorders occur, what can be done to help people. And there are two different kinds of understanding. One is nomothetic understanding, and this is usually what we're striving for in research. It's thinking about things on a name or definitional level, trying to apply it to everybody. But in psychology, we also sometimes want to know idiographic information and understanding. And idiographic means individual. So if you're a therapist sitting across from your client, yeah, you've got the nomothetic understanding in the back of your mind, but you want to know how it applies to that person in front of you. And that's the idiographic understanding. All right. So psychologists use the scientific method to obtain evidence. And it has 3 steps, and sometimes you'll see these broken into different ways. The first main thing is you are going to formulate a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess, basically. It's a tentative statement about the relationship between 2 variables, 2 ideas, 2 concepts. So oftentimes your observations or thoughts about things may generate these research hypotheses. These are very often grounded in existing theories and trying to find ways to test those. Then you're going to gather appropriate data to test your hypothesis. So this might be questionnaires. This might be observing what people do. This might be brain scan data. You know, there's a whole host of things that this data could be. And then you use statistics to analyze your findings. Psychologists use various research methods to test these hypotheses. And that's actually what the rest of this lecture will be about, is what are these various methods. And so the results of the data analysis will either support your hypothesis or fail to support it, which we sometimes call refute it. Then you're going to report your findings. And we do this in a whole host of ways. So the most common ways within science to report your findings are to present it at a conference. So we attend scientific meetings and present it to other researchers. And then to present it by writing it up and getting it published as a journal article. But there are lots of other ways to report your findings. And especially in modern days, we've come up with lots of different ways. So I was sort of challenging one of my other classes to come up with fun ways to think about how you might report your findings. And one of them came up with TED Talks. Yeah, this is one of the ways we get stuff out there now. Twitter. I've seen psychologists tweet about their findings, right? You know, just things like press releases, interviews with the local media, fun interactive reports, things along those lines. And the reason we want to report the findings is because if we just like find it and we're like, woohoo, no one else can benefit from that knowledge, right? And sometimes it might even be like a popular press book or a blog post too. All right, so again, we're going to be thinking about eating throughout this lecture. So what do you all think? Why do people eat? To live, yeah. You know, we need basic fuel. Other reasons. Hunger. Or something else over here?
Taste.
Taste, yeah. Sometimes we just like it, right? What are some other reasons people eat? What's that? Energy, yeah.
Satisfy like cravings.
Yeah, satisfy cravings, right? Ooh, I really want that chocolate right now. Or for whatever reason, for me, it's often like buffalo wings or my weird craving I get. I don't know why. Yeah, you're bored. A lot of people will snack when they're bored. It happened to a lot of people during the pandemic. They like joked about the like COVID-15, right? That a lot of people put on weight during the pandemic because they're like, I don't know what to do with myself, so they were snacking. What are some other reasons you might eat? Say, why would you go buy a pint of ice cream and eat it by yourself? If you're sad, yeah, someone just broke up with you, right? I remember in college, one of my ex-boyfriend obviously, broke up with me like the day before Valentine's Day. And I went the day after Valentine's Day and bought all the discounted candy. It's not healthy, but it made me feel better. Yeah, so for emotions, you might eat as well. So these all pop up here. Oh, one thing we didn't mention. Yeah, like we go and celebrate things with food, right? We hang out with our friends or go on dates or surrounding food. Board was on here. Oh, self-care, right? You treat yourself. I actually heard on the radio on the way in here, there was a recent study that found that people treat yourself about 6 times a month. Like, good for us. We deserve to be treated, right? Yeah, and sometimes it's to avoid or try to soothe negative emotions. So our hypothesis based on that might be people who binge eat will be more likely to binge eat in response to negative moods when they're sad, mad, anxious, overwhelmed, than in response to like a neutral mood. And as we go through, we'll talk about the various ways different techniques and research would address that hypothesis. We're going to start with the case study just because it's really the first research technique ever. And so this provides a detailed interpretive description of a person's life and psychological problems. And it could serve as a source of new ideas about behavior. So for example, Freud's theories were entirely based on case studies. It's a good inspiration for future research in that it can offer tentative support for a theory, or it could challenge a theory's existing assumptions and be like, no, this isn't working. It could inspire new therapeutic techniques or offer opportunities to study unusual problems. Yeah.
It's a single person. Does it have to be a person that is?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we could do a single case study on like an animal. Certainly, comparative psychologists, which is another group we didn't talk about, tend to study animal behavior and compare it to human behavior. Yeah.
What was that name with the railroads?
Oh, Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage.
Yeah,
That's
he's a
my
good
favorite.
example of a
That's
case
my
study.
favorite.
Yeah, so for those of you who are like, that name sounds vaguely familiar, you haven't heard of Phineas Gage before. He was a railroad foreman, well-respected, nice, likable guy. He was tamping down a tamping iron and they were using dynamite to blow their way through mountains. He like, something distracted him, he turned his head, he's caused a spark, it exploded. And the tamping iron, which was like a rod about this long, it kind of looked like a javelin, like it was pointed on one side, went all the way up through his head, basically. And he is the main reason we know that emotions and personality are controlled in the prefrontal cortex of our brain, because a lot of his ability to modulate his emotions is gone, his personality changed, his friend says he was no longer Gage. He's the one that's like, yeah, he's a really cool case study. And
it's amazing that he survived.
he
that.
survived and he lived, I want to say
That
like 10 years after that he lived.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he eventually died of seizures related to it. But yeah, I mean, he couldn't work for the railroad anymore, but he worked jobs. He worked with animals, which are often very therapeutic, right? So yeah, we're not gonna go and randomly assign people to get a railroad rod through their heads, right? In an experiment, but we can study one dude that happened to happen to. That's such a good example.
That's one of my favorite ones. It's just like, first off, how did he survive? like,
Right.
Not getting a bacterial infection.
Right?
In that time.
Yeah,
That's
it's
just a miracle.
sometimes you're just lucky, right? And we'll pick up with case studies on Monday, and then we'll get to correlations and stuff I'm sure that's related to. There is actually correlation between shark attacks and ice cream. It's just, yeah, it's just ice cream consumption, and it's just that it's hot when both happen. So correlation does not equal causation. You buying more ice cream does not mean you're gonna get attacked by a shark, I promise. All right, have a good weekend. Enjoy the weather. It's supposed to be gorgeous this weekend. Oh, and we do have class on Monday, even though it's Labor Day. I know it sucks. I don't want to work then either, but we do have class. Oh, shit.